And we're on, I believe. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Well, good morning from our part of the world. And welcome to this panel, Gaming in Migrant Spaces. I'm Mahar, and I'm joined by Earl and Tina. And we're all here in Hong Kong, broadcasting to you at Big Bad Con Online. So, first, before I continue, just what this panel is all about. Gaming in Migrant Spaces asks how we enter and create communities where newcomers in a different country experiences in community building, navigating different narratives practices, and finding places of safe play are explored in this conversation where immigration and gaming intersect. We're also going to look at how this space raises questions regarding the dynamics of power, design, and welcoming. So we're happy to start a conversation from different parts of the world. We will have other panels in Big Bad Con, I understand, from South Asia, Oceania, Latin America, and Southeast Asia later during this weekend. So, one caveat before we begin. Obviously, we are three Filipinos from Hong Kong, are living in Hong Kong. This isn't a universal experience of migration. We're simply trying to represent and show what we know and have gotten feedback from people from all over the world who all chose Hong Kong as their destination for work and migration. Okay, every migrant community is unique to their context and their own countries of origin. So, before we begin, with all of that done and set in mind, okay, why don't we continue with that and let's introduce each other to each other. Let's introduce ourselves. So, Earl or Tina, would you like to begin?
Earl, go ahead.
Oh yeah, then I'll start. So hi everyone, my name is Earl. I run currently a D&D online community here in Hong Kong called the Glowing Fool, and it's just the idea that the world would be a better place if everyone played D&D or any sort of TTRPG. So it's bringing all those people together in one space and helping everyone sort of help each other out in that journey.
Fantastic. And Tina, how about you?
Hi, my name is Tina. I work in Hong Kong, but I was born in the Philippines, grew up in both Philippines and Hong Kong. I would spend a year here, a year there, just shuttling back and forth. I consider myself a third culture kid. I feel like a foreigner in the Philippines. I feel more pressure to be Filipino in Hong Kong. I work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space right now, recently transitioning from the NGO space after 12 years.
Okay, so, and I'm Mahar, and I design games sometimes, and I'm a more recent migrant compared to Erlentina. So I left the Philippines in 2017, and I have been working here ever since. Okay, so here is the question. Like, before we even ask the thing of how did you get into gaming, which is a different conversation. How did we get into gaming in Hong Kong? That's a big question for many people. Like, how do you get into gaming when you belong to a different citizenship or a different country?
So I can start first.
Yeah, please do, Earl.
So I got into gaming. So my first introduction to like TTRPGs or D&D in general was through a lot of like the real play D&D shows that showed up online. So like Critical Role being the big name of it. So seeing that and wanting to be able to experience something similar to that, I started sort of looking out for other communities, self-learning, trawling the internet, the subreddits, etc. And then I came across this meetup group that was having these public TTRPG drop in, drop out sessions. So I joined those, got to know a bit more about how the game actually runs, and then started running my own games, and then eventually sort of built my own community around the idea of playing games with one another.
All right, and Tina, how about you? How'd you get into gaming here in Hong Kong?
Well, my introduction to a variety of board games was through a mutual friend of ours, Vince from Press Start Hong Kong. But for D&D and other TTRPGs, I tried it out before with a few people here and there, but my introduction to regular D&D games was really through Earl and the Glowing Fool. But I think both Press Start and the Glowing Fool really focused on that community aspect of it being a way to meet different people, and in Hong Kong we're incredibly diverse community here. So yeah, it's just been I guess maybe like past 7 6 7 years that I've really gotten into these sorts of games.
Okay, so here's the thing. This is a panel on gaming and migrant in my basically in migrant spaces, and I think many people don't understand is that for a lot of people who don't come from where gaming is common, meaning to say like the USA or Europe, when you're a gamer in Asia, in many cases, what tends to happen is that there was a migrant experience or access to someone who had migrated in order for you to start gaming. So, what does that mean? It means that you needed access to what is essentially a foreign good and practice. uh, Gaming often means you have to be familiar with the foreign. So that means that when you're from into RPGs from a non-Western country or the global South, that there's a very high chance that you've interacted with someone who migrated also. Someone had to bring the game or see the game from abroad and then bring it in. It also means that you need to be familiar with what is essentially a second or foreign language
Mm.
because not everyone speaks English. So in many cases, the act of migration is and the act of gaming are highly interrelated with the need to interact with foreign concepts. So that is something that like people tend to like not realize. Like, I don't know, would you say that gaming's made the migrant experience better for you or bearable for the two of you?
I think for me, absolutely. When you're in a society like Hong Kong, and you go out of your way to make your community, the type of people that you want to interact with, regardless of where they're from. The tendency is you find great people from all walks of life, from different backgrounds. And it's much easier when you have a common activity, something you all enjoy. There are set rules and you can play around with them, of course. But it's just that point of commonality that draws out other points of commonality despite the differences.
Yeah. Earl, how about you? Like, do you find it like I don't know. One of my closer friend groups now in Hong Kong are the people I game with.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, and I think that's something in general where gaming just brings people closer together. Like in general, I think that's a fairly common experience for a lot of gamers. To your point specifically, though, about gaming being a migrant experience, um, I that was what I experienced in Hong Kong. Like for me, my desire to start gaming started in Hong Kong, and then I specifically needed to find people who had gamed before. Just by nature of TTRPGs, right? It's so difficult to pick up by yourself. You sort of generally you need someone to guide you through it because of the nature of tabletop role playing games. So I ended up, like I mentioned, I ended up learning how to play through a meetup group. And this meetup group was 80% migrant in the sense that they either came to Hong Kong from like wherever their country of origin was, or they're originally from Hong Kong, but they spent a significant time abroad in Western countries and then came back. And then, they picked up the hobby there, brought it back, and they tried to form their own groups. So I think that it is very valid, the idea of gaming being a migrant experience in that regard.
Well, okay, so like here's how it's like when you migrate, right? At least for many Filipinos. Before I migrated to Hong Kong, I needed to get my research done, which was where will I get my Filipino ingredients? If I ever miss home, where will I get my junk food?
Mm,
Where will I be able to speak my language? Who your social networks, right? This
yeah.
is the nature of many migrants. You tend to look for your community, right? Like Filipino Town for me is the best place ever. Like, let's go over to Worldwide Center, Central B, Exit B1, and if you want to feel like you're at home in Manila, if you're from Manila, that's the place to go.
Mm,
The thing is, you don't really have that in terms of gaming. It's
yeah.
like that was not part of my handbook. Like, where was I gonna find people to play with? And
So,
and that
mhm,
yeah, right. So how did we it necessitated finding people from your gaming clan, for lack of a better term, to come together. And then that's when I realized it's not going to come from necessarily the Filipino community. It was going
mm,
to have to come from many diverse sets of people because I think gamers are not exactly. I think gaming is not exactly popular in any culture, so to speak. So you need to find like the minorities of the minorities.
I think just going back to what you said, right, about like forming your gaming clan, I would say, I think this is my experience, and I would hazard to say that it's maybe similar to your experience, Tina, is that you form your gaming clan from your existing friend group. Because for us, a lot of it was like our the people that we play with originally did not go looking for playing TTRPGs or D&D. It's just that we keep gushing about it a lot to our friend groups. And then they say like, D&D, that's familiar. TTRPGs, that's weird. I want to try that. Or we gush about it and then someone says, "Oh, D&D, yeah, I played that too in my own home game." So like they're so, I don't know why, but so many gamers and TTRPG players, at least here, are so closeted. We don't talk about it so much. And then when someone talks about it randomly in a party, you're like, "Yes, I want to talk to you."
Like,
And
right.
then that just forms the group, and then it just expands to form that clan.
It's almost like you're all gaming from the closet, which is really weird when you think about it. Like what resources were available for you when you started gaming? Like Tina, how did you start?
Honestly, it was through Earl. But no, I agree with your point, Earl, of us kind of converting our friends, like those
Yeah,
that we could drag along to games, or organizing a birthday party and hey, we're gonna play games.
yeah.
If you don't want it, tough.
Mhm.
But you're right. It's converting our existing friends, and then when they bring in other folks, then you game with them. Um, Sorry, I'm kind of losing my train of thought. One thing about the idea about playing from the closet and all of that, I actually feel that gaming here, and my experience as a woman, is when I say I play games, people think it's cool. So it's actually currency, social currency for me to say like, oh yeah, I do play D&D. It's like, oh really? Like it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, why is it so different if you're a woman versus if you're a man who plays, or however else you identify? It's an interesting experience, which I just kind of grin and bear it. There's a lot of other things that we could talk about, like, oh, you're Filipino, you speak that way, or a lot of different things. But anyway, um, it's a cool factor for me, so I don't necessarily hide it. It's like one of the things that I lead with, even, which I think encourages people to just say like, yeah, I have tried it, or I have a few board games at home, and that's a really good in for events. I'm an introvert, and so at these events, it's I have a few go-to phrases of how do I connect with people, especially when I know nothing about their culture, and it becomes quite activity based, and then the culture kind of creeps in as you play these games and create these worlds.
Mm.
I think we're going to explore that in a bit, actually. Like when you actually start finally playing in a largely mixed migrant group, a few issues do come up, and then you have to learn how to navigate that. Uh,
Yeah.
the resources that often tend to happen with us is the use of things like meetup.com or some, oh my gosh, Facebook groups. And it's like it,
I've not done Facebook.
shudder. And so as a result, like but we have seen some like emerging groups, like the Gloaming Fool had events
Hmm.
pre-pandemic, which I
Yeah.
really appreciated. And then we also had we still have like One Shot Saturdays. That's another group here in Hong Kong that does stuff on Saturday afternoons, that they do introduce games, and then they do kind of, I guess, curate who goes, because if you have like a bad record somewhere else, they're going to say, please don't do this, like, no bueno, that kind of stuff. But definitely, the initial thing is, if you're not aware of these resources, what tends to happen is either A, you slowly but surely reveal your interests and you convert your friends,
Mm.
or B, you luck out and you
Mm.
find something. So in my case, I had done both. I did One Shot Saturdays. I did experimental Monday gaming, which is
Mm.
another thing I did for a while before the pandemic. And then um, I met Tina through open mic nights, who then introduced me to Vince and Earl, and then
Mm.
all these things continued. So that's really quite important. Like like any other migrant experience, when you find your people, you hold on,
Yeah,
and then you try to build from there.
yeah.
Yes, but the thing is, though, even though the three of us here are all Filipino, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone we play with is Filipino. And I think this is where we have to go into a fairly important question. And I think Tina, you thank you for giving me something to segue easily into this question, which is, how do you then bring in our culture and our own identity into games? And conversely, how do we um, learn about and successfully incorporate and respect other people's cultures and their own backgrounds into our games, because then we find ourselves often in diverse spaces when you are in a migrant space of gaming.
Big question. Earl? My go-to.
So I can't really speak so much about incorporating like my own culture, my own like Chinese Filipino sort of culture into games, because typically not that's not sort of my go-to. What I can talk about though, and this is just circling back to what you said, is so the community that I run, the Glowing Fool, pre-pandemic, one of the things I wanted to do with it was to use it as a force for social good. And how that sort of materialized was, I have a friend, we have a common friend here in Hong Kong who runs an NGO that supports asylum seeker refugees in Hong Kong. They're a wonderful NGO known as Learning Together, and they support young asylum seekers, help them with education programs, giving them scholarships to attend universities, providing sort of school support. So I wanted to sort of like use D&D. We were focusing on D&D to sort of support them somehow. And what we found out was that a lot of people in Hong Kong want to play D&D because they see it in a show somewhere. They see it's popular. A lot of people want to try it, but because it has such a high barrier to entry, specifically to your point, Mahar, right? Like you need someone who's had that migratory experience or who knows a migrant and has done D&D before to introduce you to the game. It's very difficult to get into by yourself. So what we did was that we organized an event where we publicized that, look, you want to play D&D, we're organizing an event, here's an entry fee, all proceeds of the entry fees will go to support this wonderful charity that supports asylum seeker refugees in Hong Kong. You pay the entry fee, show up, we the organizers will provide everything. We'll bring the DMs, we'll bring the player handbooks, we'll bring the rules, we'll bring the dice, we'll bring character sheets, everything. Just show up, sit down, and play. So that attracted a lot of people because D&D is popular and they want to try it, and this was their opportunity to do so. What I
Yeah.
sort of did, and actually Tina, you and Mahar both actually helped out with that. So thank you. But what we did was that on top of that, what I endeavored to do was I wanted to write a one shot. So all the DMs, all the tables would be playing the same adventure. So everyone could like sort of talk about it after. The one adventure that we gave to the DMs was one that I wrote in conjunction with the Asylum Seeker Refugee NGO, where it would sort of tell the story of asylum seeker refugee experiences. So to give the sort of like, handle the issue from two sides, the practical side, which is the availability of funds, and the other side, which is added awareness on the nuances of becoming an asylum seeker refugee. So I went through a couple of iterations on what the adventure would look like. I play tested it with the with the experts. I play tested it with some asylum seekers. I play tested it with the NGO organizers, and just a lot of feedback, a lot of ideas and concepts that I, as an outsider looking in to the asylum seeker refugee experience, was not familiar with at all. What are the sort of things to avoid? What are the things you ought to emphasize? And how can you get a player to empathize with the asylum seeker refugee experience? So we did that. We refined the story. We put it out. Everyone played. And then the thing that surprised me the most is that after all the tables were done, we got all the participants together to have a bit of a debrief, right? Like, oh, how did you find playing the game? What did you think about D&D? What was confusing? What was not, etc. And then towards the end of that, I sort of asked them, did any of you find anything interesting about the story? Like, did anything stand out to you at all? And most of them said no. And when I revealed to them that, well, the story that you just played, the scenario, is exactly what asylum seeker refugees experience every day. And here's why. And for a lot of them, they were genuinely surprised, either because A, they did not really fully know about the asylum seeker refugee experience, or B, they just didn't notice it at all because they were so engaged with the story already. But then after it was pointed out, they sort of had that, oh, like I could
Yeah.
hear the collective audience go, ah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, no, that
Yeah.
makes sense now.
I remember that event. It was
Yeah,
like almost like, yo, that's why all of us could not be second level druids and cast Goodberry. Okay, like that
yeah,
spell had to not be available
yeah.
because suddenly it was like, wait, you mean you can't create food um,
Hmm.
just to get
Hmm.
there? Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so in that regard, we do have basically like formal events which do
Mm.
directly and highlight exactly what some groups of migrants go through.
Yeah.
So we do that. We have created events. Earl in particular has created events where migration greatly features within the game itself, and you see that culture. But then the next part goes into what about your everyday or every evening table, where it's just your group, it's just you, and like how do you find yourself like expressing your nature, your culture through the game. Because the other thing is, as a migrant, I find that whenever we play D&D, we tend to default to what I call the white version, right? Like, we think Lord of the Rings,
Mm.
and we think all of these tropes, which unfortunately many of them feature people who are not like us, at least initially in my experience. And lately, while that's been improving, like how do we bring ourselves into the game itself, like, and our experiences into the game itself? Because we do enter very diverse tables. Like my group right now has someone who is half Chinese, half British, fully Chinese Filipino,
Mm.
South African, and myself. Like it becomes a very, and we've had moments where it's like, are we on the same cultural page here? Do we have the same references? And we're also all, except for one person, we're also all migrants. So how do
Mm.
we then move into ourselves in game and making that happen? Like Tina, I think you've had that, right? Where you explore Filipino-ness in game.
Absolutely. I mean, to take a step back, so I personally really enjoy folklore, fairy tales, and myths, and this is something that's been with me even as a child, even before I knew anything about this. Um, I enjoy African and Asian myths, but I will be the first to admit that I'm more familiar with the stories and tropes from the West, product of upbringing and all that. I mentioned earlier, I feel a bit like a foreigner when I'm back home, in quotes, in the Philippines. Whereas in Hong Kong, I feel my Filipino-ness more. I mean, I'm proud of our history and culture, um, but it's been a conscious effort for me to learn more about it because I want to better represent where I come from. And so it's been a learning experience for me as well as the people around me, just kind of inserting things in. So I obstinately name my characters. It'll be from different cultures, sometimes a bit more Filipino, but definitely the values that they have are absolutely true to what I know. So my characters tend to be caring, conscious of group harmony. It's a very different group dynamic, I think, when you have migrants. It's very much about being collegial in decision making, really consulting, rather than someone kind of going off and doing the rash thing. Although we do have somebody in the group who does that a lot.
It
Every group has
happens.
that. It's a yeah.
Um,
Mm.
so I've been one of the games I think that best illustrates how we insert our culture and identity is this game that I've been playing for about 2 years now. So a good friend of mine, he's Filipino American, and he's created this homebrew called Campaign of the Pearl, and he's woven in all the myths and characters, as well as more recent dynamics of politics and other cultural objects from the Philippines, from different parts of the Philippines as well, because the Philippines is incredibly diverse, 1,000 plus islands. So in that game, we have white Americans and other third culture kids. That tends to be the mix of people that I play with. And everyone enjoys the world because it's a great, it's great world building. And I've been playing for 2 years, and it's really deep lore as well. I mean, for a homebrew, I really kudos to my friend. Um, and we just kind of unapologetically insert those Filipino references, and the people from America who don't get it, I have to explain to them why I'm just laughing my head off because they don't get it. And I think it's a refreshing sort of dynamic where they're learning, but also it comes from a desire to share.
Mm.
And I think that comes through, and everyone just kind of, it gives permission to everyone at the table to actually bring something in and say, what do you think? And because of that initial gameplay where people who have been on the outside, so migrants, they're so excited to see themselves, things that they hold dear in the game, and just treat it as normal because it is normal to us. It's our day-to-day life.
Mhm.
And people who are not familiar with that kind of coming in and realizing, oh, it's not this mystical, exotic. It kind of sometimes be depending on the game, but it's not such um, an other. They can connect with certain things, but they can be fascinated with what's different to their experience. But I think it's partly that it's just being unapologetic, putting those things in, and guiding that person who is unfamiliar with that dynamic, and just saying, "Oh, this is why we're laughing. This is you know." Give a bit of a backstory, and support them through that. And I think that sort of softer approach is very, to my mind, Asian, or whatever Asian is. The more, less about you must do this. It's more setting the environment. Here are our agreed upon rules. Play in this space.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I think the second part comes in, which is that after you find your group, the diverse gaming group, by virtue of us all being migrants, all have to agree on safety.
Mm.
So we've all had to go like, okay, this is how discussions are working. And I think, at least maybe in my experience and so far in Hong Kong, people tend to be like, okay, we all have to adjust because we're all foreign here.
Mm.
And I think we're more used to it in that regard. So what tends to happen is, okay, so what are the do's and don'ts? Is this okay with you? I've had to tell some groups before, like, no, we're not doing that. And I've had to tell other groups, okay, this is new, but sure. But that can only happen in safely established spaces. So which is why I'm so grateful for safety tools becoming like a common thing. I don't know if those were common for you in your initial like gaming exposures, but for me, it's like this is an innovation that I wish was around 2 decades ago. So in that regard, I think like safety tools really intersects quite well in a migrant space.
Mm.
I'm so glad that they exist,
Mm.
And
right?
I've taken those tools. I've learned from you, Mahar, like the games that I've played where you were GMing. I've taken those back into my teams, the teams that I manage in the workplace. It's really helped. I think that sort of common agreement of this is what we stand for, this is what we will not stand for. Um, it's been so helpful, and people in the corporate world, they're like, "Oh wow." It's like, no, this isn't me. I got it from the gaming community.
RPGs.
Exactly. And so actually then they become interested, as we weave in, because I do work a little bit in learning and development, so weaving in storytelling and games and they're so amazed by how effective games can, make these points hit home and not just be a lecture.
Mm.
But it's not always perfect, right? We've had moments where we're like, oh God, why? So like I guess when the things become bad, when the colonial experience or your non-colonizer experience, or whenever the cultures or the migrant space feels like there's a tension now,
Mm.
what do we do to become aware of these biases? Like, how do we then I guess change this so that this agreement of being a migrant space is maintained in a way that is still respectful? Because I think that's often the biggest challenge when you have people of so many different cultures trying hard to represent ourselves, but we also have our biases which we don't reflect on, and we might accidentally hurt other people.
I think no. I'm just thinking back to the interactions we've had in the Glowing Fool chat, Mahar, because I think that instances of that where like generally we try to keep the chat and keep the online community as sort of like safe and as like open as possible. But even with that intent and even with us taking, the necessary precautions, sometimes people still unintentionally say something or do something that can come off as offensive to people of a different situation, of a different culture, of a different background. And I guess for us, for me, that was a learning experience. I guess on like try on build on community building, wherein how I reacted to that was okay. We've identified what's happened. We've identified why this is offensive, and then it's just not it's a case of okay, let's just take this person off to the side. So for me it was when there was a problem, I would just DM the person directly, so not having it in the public forum, but directly interacting with them and say, hey, what you said here, I know that you did not intend for it to be taken badly. I know there was no malicious intent, but this was how it was received on the other side. And I just, hopefully you just be conscious of it, be aware that sometimes, what we say could be hurtful or could be offensive, and just try to, as much as possible, refrain from doing it in the future. And just, explaining why, and then making sure that they know sort of which pitfalls, how to navigate that in the future. And then hopefully they sort of settle themselves for that.
Would you say there's a lot of emotional labor involved in this process? Like, often, I don't think people think about how hard it is for a community to be maintained. So, like, okay, so I'm telling stories out of school here. So like Earl has the glowing fool, and we have multiple channels in which you can talk. The Discord's not so active. It's the WhatsApp group, because
Mm.
WhatsApp's king in Hong Kong, which
Yeah.
is really, really like the place.
Mm.
And I remember one time where we were discussing what is that MMO? The one with the
Oh, in the WhatsApp.
conquistador at the front. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. New
New
World.
World or
New World.
something. Yeah.
New
Mhm.
World. We were discussing it, and I remember like there was that moment of tension
Mm.
where we had some people say, "Oh, I just love this. This is wonderful," and I was just kind of like, "This is colonization." I like literally see the picture of a conquistador. You know what I mean? It's like
Mm.
that is literally what we see in our textbooks as what started off this process of colonization. Like that was their uniform.
Mm.
And I remember that being a moment where like there was an assumption that because we're all migrants here,
Mm.
we're all the same,
Mm.
but we're not.
Yeah.
So that led into a rather heavy discussion, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and it's I think the and I think it's the kind of discussion that is quite common in diverse spaces, but becomes a little bit heightened in a migrant space because your context is you still assume sameness because migrant becomes an umbrella
Mm.
Like we're all the other here, right? Without realizing that no, your other A, your other B, your other C, your other D, and your other E, and some others are more othered than other. I'm not making. I hope I'm making sense, but does that make sense to y'all?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
like
So
it's the
like,
same how all three of us are. We're all Filipino. We all identify as Filipino, but we've had such different Filipino experiences, right? And so, like we were talking about it a while ago. We're different flavors of Filipino. Um,
okay, yeah. I mean, I guess there is a question here which dovetails directly into it, which is what's one essential piece of advice that we would like to give to anyone seeking to cultivate a safe, diverse space? I hope I read that correctly. Yes. So what is that advice you want to give when you want to cultivate the safe and diverse space?
I'd like to jump in just because I feel like Earl will have more specific examples and tips. But in general, I think that we need to emphasize to others that, especially in the migrant space, that our power is contextual. So you take us in one space, we might be the ones enjoying all these privileges. In another space, we're seen as, barely even human. Um, and setting that context that at this point, so for example, in Hong Kong, if you're local Hong Kong Chinese, you're at the top. You fly to the West, you're a minority and you have a very different experience. And I think for a lot of people here who have studied abroad or grew up abroad, they understand that. And when you have people who don't have that personal experience or it's not pointed out to them, I think we have to make sure that within that community, we recognize those different experiences. And we can go to some practical tips later, but the general principle is, you could be at the top right now, you know, different contexts. You get on a plane, you could, be the minority. Um, and the same thing, we mentioned this before the call, talking about the colonial experiences in the Philippines. So right now, I see myself as a brown person living in Hong Kong. In the Philippines, we're the majority. Sure, we are the Filipinos. But you speak to the indigenous people who are not treated well, are not even recognized by the government. Um, they see us as the foreigners. So I think we just need to be aware of our position, depending on the context.
Earl, how
just
about you? Sorry, you first, Earl.
so, just like looking at the question specifically, right, and um, to the point of like creating a safe and diverse space, I think, and this is just me, like sort of from the experience I've had, it could be entirely different for a lot of different people. But for me, it was making it very clear what the purpose of this space is. And for me, it was like, we're here because we want to play this game. And we also acknowledge that in order for us to play this game, we need to be able to feel comfortable and safe in the space that we've created for us to be able to do the stated goal, which is to play this game. So I am trusting you, like I'm trusting you and you're trusting me that we will, maintain this social contract of I'm not going to make you comfortable, you will not make me uncomfortable, and that sort of reinforces with one another so that it builds this culture of I don't want to say culture of safety, but it builds a comfortable feeling within the community itself. And then, of course, when problems do rise up, you sort of handle them as they come along, you address them. You don't try to alienize or like isolate people. You just try to like help them feel more, help them sort of no longer cause that sort of tension within the group. But I think, Mahar, you would have more specific examples since you run a much larger community than I do.
Well, no, I don't run it actually. The RPGC is leaderless.
Okay.
I just run a Discord, not a actual like, and I'm just a moderator in most of them. I think what we need to know is that sometimes we need to know the difference between identity and identification. which is to say that it is one thing to say that I am this person. It is another thing for you to identify me as that this kind of person. And there's a very thin line between the two because the first one has quite a bit of agency involving myself. The second one is all about reading the markers that I may or may not be aware that I have. So, if you want to have a safe space, especially in migrant spaces where many migrants are often taught how to identify people based on their markers, and often we get hyper aware of these markers to the point that we try to remove them. Ergo, people trying to lose their accents, people trying to curl or straighten their hair, people trying to, learn the local language and only speak that. What you need to remember is that you need to respect identities and but you need to refuse to identify. Because when you fall into the habit of identifying things and working on the tropes of these markers, that's a slippery slope towards essentializing people. So you need to see people for what they purposefully present and identity and in their identities, but not identify them for you. So that is the that is the and that's a very difficult thing. That's a very,
Mm.
very difficult thing. Honestly, like I don't think I'm perfect at it. And I think we are all taught these biases seriously. Like so all of the language you need in anti-racism and needs to be practiced more purposefully in migrant spaces as well because what at least I find in the migrant spaces, we tend to assume that we're all the same
Mm.
because we're all different. But again, it's different layers of othering. And again, it's contextual. It's quite contextual. Tino is very correct to bring that out. Now, another question here was what games have we found work the best for people trying out tabletop games for the first few times at events that we've organized? And I hate to say this because it's gonna be D&D. I mean, I don't hate to say it. It's just that some people have misapprehensions or rightful apprehensions about D&D, but it's D&D. Earl, wouldn't you say, Tina?
I
It's,
would
it's
say
D&D,
it's
right?
I would say it is D&D for a variety of different reasons. I think just mainly because it's what people recognize. Because if you up to a person and say, "Hey, do you want to play a TTRPG?" They chances are they may not even know what you're talking about. But if you walk up to a person, "Hey, do you want to play D&D?" Because D&D has this brand recognition and this space now in the pop culture, people recognize that, and chances are they would want to say yes. So it's just getting that buy-in, getting people invested in the idea of playing. For me specifically, so I still do D&D, but I call it like D&D light. So like it's D&D 5e, but I play very fast and loose with the rules and prioritizing more aspects of like player agency and their own storytelling and their ability to enact something that they want to do. So like I guess rough examples is that I prepare character sheets for like a D&D 5e wizard. And if the person playing that character says, "Oh, I want to do this spell," but it's not listed in their character sheet, I'll just say, "Yeah, sure, okay, roll me a check. You rolled high enough, great, it happens." And then we move along with the story. So it's D&D, but it's very like D&D light.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a thing. Tina, have you only done like
I've
would it?
played other
Mhm,
systems with you because you're kind enough to kind of introduce it and open my my world
mhm.
up. But I also I think the question also goes into just tabletop games, right? Not just role playing games. So just on the point of brand recognition. So I was with a group of people who weren't really into board games, but because I brought out, or one of them had a Star Wars board game, that kind of clicked with people. Oh, it's Star Wars. Let's check it out. So there's a bit of going into what you think your audience is into. Um, there are more puzzle games, more collaborative. Um, I personally choose games that aren't too long. I cannot sit for 4 or 5 hours and just, viticulture, for example, is really popular with some of my friends. I cannot. But for me, like, I know, like, you ask how long are they willing to commit into learning a game they do not know, but also what are they into. I like games that have really beautiful artwork, for example. So find that hook to get, what is it that attracts them to the
Yeah.
act of playing the game.
Yeah, I would say that many times here, and I think this is why it's so important to have a diversity of representation in games, is that for migrant spaces, it is much easier to play things which seems to include all of us. So because the migrant spaces usually, like in many, like at least in TTRPGs that we found, involves a lot of different cultures and ethnicities at once. So everyone needs to feel welcome. And it's hard to play in migrant spaces when games don't seemingly show or feel like it's for you. So, like, I've actually had a discussion with one friend here and said, "Oh, isn't that for white people?" And I'm like, I'm not white. I play it." Okay. And then it's a little bit shocking, but when you think about it, yeah, because if you feel like this is an activity that is done by another culture, it's not yours, it becomes a little bit a nervous place for migrants because even other migrants are trying to find out, will I fit in with another migrant group? And TTRPGs is also rife with those, like, not because it's inherent to TTRPGs, it's just that people don't understand that it's actually acultural. Like, it depends on your table, but if it looks like it's a different culture to mine, um, are there enough people like me in it playing, and are they okay? And that becomes a very, and it goes back to the very start of this talk, where how do you even find people to play? And that's why the project itself should try to reflect as many cultures as possible if you want it to be successful, if you want it to be used for successful introduction to migrants. Or so I think on that note, I think that's our time. But yeah, I'm just really glad actually for everyone to know Earl and Tina. They're exceptional human beings. So you should follow them on Twitter. I think Earl is Earl Nang. Or that's
Yeah,
E.
it's
So
just
yeah.
so for me on Twitter, Instagram, anything. It's just my first and last name, so Earl Ung, like sort of together.
Mhm.
So you
Same
can
as
find me
me.
on that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and then Tina is Tina Arcelia, and I am Har Har on Twitter. And of course, we are going to continue talking about this over at the Discord. It's been really wonderful. And yeah, I just love that we're here in Big Bad Con. And enjoy the rest of your weekend. Okay, so thanks everyone, and see you.